October 1975. The world holds its breath. In less than a month, on November 11th, Angola will declare independence, and everyone is racing for Luanda. The Portuguese colonial empire has collapsed, leaving behind an absolute power vacuum in Angola that threatens to set the entire southern hemisphere ablaze. But the vacuum doesn't last long. In the shadows, the Cold War has just found its bloodiest new chessboard. And this time, the pieces are moving with unprecedented violence. 3 factions are fighting for Angola, and Luanda is the prize. The MPLA, backed by a tide of Soviet advisors and heavy equipment, seems to have victory secured. Moscow isn't just sending rifles. It is unloading T-34-85 tanks and heavy artillery onto Angolan docks, with the firm intention of painting the African map red from coast to coast. However, thousands of kilometers to the south, a giant watches with a mixture of paranoia and fury. South Africa, a country with a small but lethal military, watching as communism knocks directly at its door. The government in Pretoria knows that if Luanda falls under the Soviet fist, they are next. But there is an insurmountable problem. The world is watching. International support is non-existent, and time has run out. Then, they make a decision that defies all conventional military logic. Without a formal declaration of war and operating in absolute secrecy, South Africa dispatches a small spearhead first. Task Force Zulu, roughly a few hundred men with light armored cars. And as the gamble escalates, the South African presence inside Angola grows into the thousands. Their order is so absurd, it sounds like a death sentence. Cross the border, traverse thousands of kilometers of hostile territory, and reach the capital in a matter of weeks. Keep one number in your head: 3,000 kilometers. Because that distance is about to start disappearing. No one was betting on them. Reportedly, analysts in both Western and Eastern capitals expected the South Africans to be crushed. They didn't know they were about to witness one of the boldest, fastest, and most humiliating lightning offensives of the era. This is the story of how a few hundred men, armed with suicidal mobility, brought a superpower-backed army to its knees, while the world was still trying to figure out what was happening. Welcome to Operation Savannah, the storm no one saw coming. To understand the sheer madness of Operation Savannah, one must look at the map of '75. SADF troops had already slipped into Angola in August '75, officially to protect the Ruacana-Calwek hydro installations. Angola was no longer a colony. It was a vacuum, and in the logic of the Cold War, a vacuum is an invitation for a storm. 2 titans were preparing to collide in the African bush, each bringing a diametrically opposed philosophy of war. On one side stood FAPLA, the armed wing of the Marxist MPLA. They weren't just a rebel group. They were the beneficiaries of a Soviet Union determined to secure a strategic foothold in the Atlantic. Moscow's support was staggering. Shipments of T-34-85 and later T-55, heavy mortars, and the legendary AK-47 were flooding the ports. FAPLA was being built into a conventional powerhouse, designed to hold ground through sheer mass and Soviet-style static defense. And they were the shield of the revolution, backed by the industrial might of the Eastern Bloc. On the other side was the SADF, the South African Defense Force. They were the polar opposite, small, highly professional, and acutely aware that they could never win a war of attrition against the Soviet-backed masses. Their survival depended on a doctrine of extreme mobility and aggressive defense. The SADF didn't believe in holding lines. They believed in shattering them. They utilized light, fast, wheeled vehicles that could cover hundreds of miles of desert while traditional tanks were still being fueled. But the SADF couldn't just launch a full-scale invasion without triggering a global outcry. They needed something different. They needed the X factor. This took the form of Task Force Zulu. It was one of the most unconventional units in military history. A bastard formation of South African professional instructors, remnants of the defeated FNLA, and local Bushmen trackers. They were a motley crew, often wearing mismatched uniforms and operating under total radio silence. This was the spearhead. They weren't an army of occupation. They were a surgical instrument designed to strike with such speed that the enemy wouldn't even have time to understand what hit them. The challenge, however, was the scale. Look at the distance. From the Namibian border to the capital of Luanda lies nearly 3,000 kilometers of roadless terrain, dense bush, and hostile territory. It is a distance equivalent to driving from London to the middle of the Sahara. The stage was set. FAPLA had the numbers, the tanks, and the Kremlin's blessing. The SADF had the speed, the cunning, and a desperate need to keep the red tide away from their doorstep. The match was lit, and the fuse led straight to the heart of Angola. With the fuse lit and the X factor in motion, theory turned into a brutal reality. On October 14th, 75, the border between Namibia and Angola ceased to be a diplomatic line and became the launchpad for one of the most audacious offensives of the 20th century. Task Force Zulu didn't just cross the border. They pierced it like a high-velocity round. In that instant, FAPLA's numerical advantage and the weight of Soviet steel began to matter very little against a factor they had failed to calculate: absolute speed. While FAPLA commanders, trained in Eastern European doctrine, were busy preparing for a slow, methodical war of trenches and attrition, the South Africans unleashed an African version of the Blitzkrieg. The tip of the spear was the Eland 90. These four-wheeled light armored cars didn't stop for obstacles. They bypassed them. The tactic was surgical. While enemy infantry dug in expecting a frontal assault, the Elands appeared on their flanks and rear at speeds of 90 kilometers per hour, barking their high-velocity 90mm guns before the defenders could even zero in a single mortar. The advance was devastating. The town of Pereira de Essa fell almost before Luanda even knew the South Africans had crossed the border. In Rosadas, the defenders were overwhelmed by a force moving too fast to be pinned down on a map. By the time they reached João de Almeida, the sense of Task Force Zulu's invincibility was total. It wasn't just an invasion, it was a psychological demolition. Towns that should have held out for weeks were surrendered or abandoned in a matter of hours. Technical superiority was amplified by a primal terror that gripped the FAPLA ranks. What survivors would later describe as an acoustic trauma began to spread. In the stillness of the Angolan Savannah, the persistent, metallic roar of Eland engines and Unimog trucks, echoing in the distance, became the herald of inevitable death. According to later accounts from the campaign, the panic became so contagious that upon hearing the echo of South African engines approaching in the darkness, entire FAPLA battalions would abandon their positions, leaving behind heavy equipment, supplies, and ammunition without firing a single shot. In just a few days, Task Force Zulu had snapped the spine of resistance in the south. The abysmal distance to Luanda was shrinking at a frantic pace. The South Africans weren't marching. They were devouring kilometers, leaving a trail of ash and an enemy that began to believe they weren't fighting men, but a force of nature that nothing could stop. And here's the hook. The thing that finally slows them down isn't a bigger tank. It's a sound. The advance seemed unstoppable, but the roar of the South African engines was about to meet an echo just as terrifying. But as the dust of the southern plains settled, the horizon darkened with a new kind of defiance. The lightning war was about to hit a wall of fire. The race for Luanda had reached the capital's doorstep. But in Luanda, the game had changed. The Soviet Union wasn't going to let its investment vanish. And in Havana, Fidel Castro made a decision that would alter African history forever. Operation Carlota was born. Hundreds of Cuban troops arrived first. Then the numbers surged into the thousands, turning a local skirmish into a global ideological furnace. The climax centered on the Battle of Quifangondo, just miles from the capital. This was primarily an FNLA-ELNA push on Luanda, backed by Zairian forces, with a small South African artillery and advisor detachment supporting the attack. The battle matters because it showcased rocket artillery and slammed the door on a quick capture of the capital. For the South Africans and their FNLA allies, the city was in sight, but between them and Luanda lay a swampy valley that would become a graveyard of ambitions. It was here that the attackers met the most terrifying sound of the Cold War. Cuban BM 21 Grad rocket launchers. These Soviet-made truck-mounted rocket launchers could saturate an entire grid square with 4,100 22mm rockets in seconds. The scream of the incoming barrage was a psychological hammer, turning the ground into a moonscape of craters and fire. For the first time, tactical precision was met by the Soviet doctrine of massed fire. It wasn't about accuracy anymore. It was about erasing the map. Yet, a tactical truth emerged. In Savannah, elands rarely even met tanks. When they did, their speed and positioning mattered more than brute armor. One documented skirmish later in the campaign even saw eland 90mm fire engage T-34s across a blown bridge. At Quifangondo, it was rockets and massed fire that decided the tempo, trapping the attackers on a narrow approach and breaking the assault. The battle became a desperate chess match of range and nerves. The South Africans used their 140mm guns and mortar precision to snipe at the Cuban positions, while the Cubans used their rocket batteries to keep the attackers at bay. The lightning had been caught in a storm of steel, and now the biggest retention pivot. Even if you win on the ground, you can still lose in a building. The Blitzkrieg hadn't failed, but for the first time, the South Africans realized they weren't just fighting a local militia anymore. They were staring into the eyes of a global communist expeditionary force. And the cost of the next mile was about to become astronomical. How does an army that has won almost every engagement on the field suddenly find itself forced into a retreat? The answer wasn't found in the mud of Quifangondo, but in the carpeted halls of Washington, D.C. By the closing months of the campaign, the South African Blitzkrieg had become a victim of its own success. The invisible intervention was no longer a secret. As photos of South African soldiers captured by FAPLA hit the international wires, the geopolitical temperature reached a boiling point. The world, already repulsed by the apartheid regime, exploded in condemnation. South Africa, once the silent partner of the West in containing communism, suddenly became a political radioactive isotope. Even those who had quietly encouraged the invasion now scrambled for the exits. The final blow came from politics, not the battlefield. As the intervention became impossible to hide, the diplomatic cover evaporated and the operation turned toxic in Washington. South Africa pulled back, and by late March '76, its forces had withdrawn. Months later, on June 30th, '76, the U.S. Congress locked the cutoff into law with the Clark Amendment, prohibiting assistance for military or paramilitary operations in Angola unless Congress explicitly authorized it. The South Africans, standing just miles from their ultimate objective, were left holding a check that Washington refused to cash. Without American diplomatic cover or logistical backing, the SADF realized they were standing alone on a collapsing bridge. Faced with the prospect of an open-ended war against a Soviet-Cuban juggernaut without a single international ally, Pretoria ordered a strategic withdrawal. What followed was a masterpiece of military discipline. Unlike the chaotic retreats often seen in post-colonial conflicts, the SADF executed a cold, calculated, and perfectly phased withdrawal. They moved southward with the same precision they had used to invade, dismantling infrastructure as they went, and leaving a scorched earth reality for the following FAPLA forces. They weren't being chased out. They were choosing to leave, but they were leaving Angola in flames. Operation Savannah did not end in the capture of Luanda, but it birthed a legend. The retreat solidified the myth of SADF invincibility. They had humiliated Soviet-backed forces, faced Cuban rocket artillery, and only stopped because their friends in the West had lost their nerve. For the next 15 years of the border war, the memory of the South African Blitzkrieg would haunt every FAPLA commander. They knew that while the politicians in Washington might waver, the giants from the South were capable of striking anywhere, at any time, with a speed that no one in Africa could match. The dust eventually settled on the roads to Luanda, but the silence that followed was heavy with contradiction. On paper, the strategic victory belonged to the MPLA and their Cuban allies. With the South African withdrawal, the Marxist regime consolidated its power, securing the capital and the official recognition of the international community. For the Soviet bloc, it was a triumph of endurance over speed. Yet, underneath the political surface, the reality of the African battlefield told a different story. And Operation Savannah left behind a lethal legacy, the myth of the SADF warrior. For the next decade and a half, the sheer speed and audacity of the South African Blitzkrieg became the psychological gold standard in the region. The SADF had proven that a small, highly mobile force could humiliate a vastly larger, conventionally armed army. This campaign redefined military lessons for the continent, proving that in the vast, unforgiving African terrain, logistics and mobility are more decisive than raw numbers or heavy steel. A tank that cannot reach the battlefield is just a very expensive landmark. A light armored car that can strike 3,000 kilometers from its base is a strategic nightmare. This was an operation that never existed, according to official records of the time. South African soldiers returned to a home that could not publicly honor them, and their fallen were buried in the shadows of a secret war. Yet, this phantom campaign changed the map of the 20th century. It set the stage for 15 more years of the border war, turned Angola into a permanent Cold War furnace, and forced every world power to realize that the tip of Africa would not be taken without a fight. Ultimately, Operation Savannah was a masterclass in tactical brilliance and political failure. It showed that while you can win 1,000 miles in a week, you can lose it all in a single afternoon in a distant diplomatic office. It remains a haunting reminder that in war, the fastest ghost on the battlefield still has to answer to the reality of the world it leaves behind. If you are fascinated by the hidden chapters of history and the wars the textbooks chose to forget, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think South Africa made a fatal mistake by stopping at the gates of Luanda? Or was the withdrawal the only way to save their army from a total Soviet trap? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Africa War Files. I'll see you in the next video.